Thank you, James. I'm glad to be online talking to all my friends who love Viking cruise ships and who love history and who love spices. Oh, it reminds me, a little sip of spiced tea. That's Mrs. Bigelow's famous recipe. Are you familiar with that kind of spiced tea? It's got let's see, what did I taste in it? Cinnamon and cloves and a little coriander and obviously black tea and supposedly other secret ingredients, but it is a delightful drink, especially on a day like today. It's a little chilly here in St. Louis, Missouri. By the way, before I forget, happy season's greetings as we enter the time of holidays. And in a day or two, there's going to be a turkey cooking from Professor Nethery Fuller in our oven. And it'll be a small Thanksgiving for us this year, and it'll be a small Christmas for us this year because all of us have to what? Stay safe. And so we'll be able to cruise again soon with Viking. First slide, please, James. So I've done this lecture before, and I was on a Viking ship in the Indian Ocean. And it was fun because we had a roundtable guess of what the various spices were in the pictures. And a few of you may not recognize lemongrass. That's down there on the lower right-hand side. And there's obviously hot chili peppers on the lower left-hand side, and cardamom and peppers and fennel and nutmeg and all the wonderful things that we can use for cooking and for brewing. I was explaining to James that there are gruits which don't use hops, but which use herbs and spices as the flavoring preservative method. And in fact, many of these herbs and spices have medicinal effects also, good ones for you. And so if you've got a little bit of tennis elbow, well, an addition of turmeric actually for some individuals is a helpful component. So spices, we're going to be talking about a variety of them and the history of them, and you're going to get the perspective from an archaeologist. Yes, I like the really old spices. Wait till we talk about those in a second. Next slide, James. So I'm going to lay out some background information about the concept of spice and spice trade. I'm going to be discussing the preludes to the spice route, and that is the incense route, the Silk Road, and then I'll talk about the spice route and then the legacy we have today with it. Thank you, James. Next slide. Oh, a timeline. You know, college professors always like these things. And what dates are we going to be tested on for the examination, Professor Fuller? Well, a couple of things for sure I'm going to be talking about. The site of Sisar in Oman, which made news recently from archaeological work there. I'm going to be talking about some of the early Neolithic farmers around 5000 BC and what one of their favorite dishes was. And then several of the other issues, the fall of Constantinople. So did you copy all those dates down? Well, there's no quiz. It's okay. I hope you enjoy the discussion of the timeline and the various things happening on the incense route, the silk route, and then the spice route. Next slide. So before there were spices, how did you make your food enhanced in terms of flavor? Well, an easy answer was the addition of salt. And you might say, well, that was convenient for anyone living along the ocean, because in certain times of the year, salt crystals will form on the rocks or some of the plant materials. But oftentimes, recovering of sea salt is a challenge. And many times, people living inland at great distances had to find other ways of getting salt. They weren't able to collect sea crystals. So we have salt mines developing in areas of Europe and in Asia, some of these going back 7,000 years ago. And not just superficial mines. Some of the salt mines in Europe go down 300 feet as they were tunneling and cutting to remove salt because it was more effective and more efficient than just trying to evaporate seawater. Have you ever heard the comment that I have to go work in the salt mine? Salt mines were difficult places. And in fact, by the Roman Empire, it was slaves who worked in the salt mines and may have been even in these earlier times. Next slide, please. So the trade of spices. Spices add different flavors. They excite the taste buds. They excite the nose, sometimes the odor. Oh my gosh, I shouldn't brag on myself, but last night I made some mulled wine out of my own red wine and a variety of different herbs I've been bringing back from various trips. And that odor, as it filled the house, made the food even more delicious also. So cinnamon and ginger and cucurbits and pepper, all these were very important discoveries of wild plants whose had aspect of their bark and their berries and their roots that pleased the human palate, pleased the nose, and in many times pleased all of the senses. Next slide. So there's three routes. There's the spice route that goes around through the Indian Ocean. You see it scooting along the coast of India, then up through the Red Sea. But before the spice route, there had been the Silk Road, and then there had been the incense road. And each of these had different commodities that made people wealthy. If you had a city on the incense route and were bringing incense, you got rich if you were involved in that economy. Likewise, silk, and then likewise with the spice route. Next slide. So this is where it's fun to have an archaeologist do the lecture. That ugly piece of pottery was found by a group of archaeologists excavating in Germany on a site very close to the ocean side. And because of the moisture of the soil and the conditions, it had allowed food substances to be preserved, which had been accidentally baked on the interior of the cooking pot. Have you ever burnt food on a cooking pot? Well, you're leaving a gift for a future archaeologist if you don't scrape it and scour it off. This pot must have been so badly burnt with food inside that they threw it away. And the broken fragments found by the archaeologists were used to reconstruct what the spices were and what the protein was. So what they did, they took a fragment of that charcoal, they dissolved it in solvents, and they looked at the dissolved carbonized material underneath the scanning electron microscope. They did not find the seeds of the spice. They found something even smaller. They found what are called phytoliths. Have you ever felt a piece of grass that has sort of sharp edges on it? Those are phytoliths, oftentimes on the edge of the plant, little silicate particles that are kind of a plant self-defense mechanism. And the phytoliths are specifically shaped for different genus and species of plants. And when they looked into the scanning electron microscope at the burnt-in food on the surface of that pot, what they found was something called garlic mustard. No, it's not garlic plus mustard. It's a single plant called garlic mustard. It grows wild in Europe and in Asia. We're trying not to have it grow wild in the United States, by the way, because it would be a pest if it ever got established in any great density. It gives a flavor that's very, very similar to something you know. It has a flavor very much like horseradish. So the food that was being cooked in this pot had garlic mustard as a spice added to it, not cultivated, but gathered wild spice, and it gave a very horseradishy flavor. So what was the protein? When they dissolved that material, they were able to then run the solution through a spectrograph, and they were able to come up with the fact that there were molecules that would indicate fish, as well as molecules that would indicate probably deer, a large hoofed wild animal. Now, I can't tell you what type of fish. Hey, maybe it was salmon. We serve a lot of salmon on Viking cruise ships. So salmon with a horseradish sauce and a little bit of red meat. That was the dish. And how do they know that this was happening at that point, 3,900 BC? Because it's burnt food, they were able to run a special kind of radiocarbon date called an AMS radiocarbon date. AMS radiocarbon dates require such a small amount of material. You can get a highly accurate date on a piece of carbon the size of a pea. And so that was the method used. If you wonder why archaeologists don't do this every day for every artifact we find, the scanning electron microscope is a couple $1,000s an hour. The spectrograph is several $100s a sample. And an AMS radiocarbon date, I've never been able to afford because there's several $1,000s. But when you think you've got an artifact like this ugly piece of pottery, that could be used to establish the first use of spice cooking in Europe, well, it was worth it. James, next slide, please. So, the use of spices in food, very important. The uses in medicine, in religion, the methods of preservation, cosmetics, the wealth, power, influence, flavoring, seasonings. These are all things that I could spend a semester discussing, particularly the issue of medicine, of spices that are used and have subtle medical values to them. I suggested turmeric is one that apparently helps with inflammation in joints and in various parts of the body that you've abused and worked too long in the garden. I don't have tennis elbow. I don't play tennis. I have gardener's elbow from lots of gardening all during the summer. Let me tell you another interesting medicinal spice story. There's a plant that grows across the Middle East and Europe, not found in the United States, except we feel cultivated, called rue, R-U-E, Ruta graveolens. And it's very interesting in translating some early inscriptions from ancient Iraq. There was a discussion of using that plant to treat a medical disorder called snakes in the brain. You might say, goodness gracious, what disease was that? We believe they were describing migraine headaches. And it's interesting that the plant, Ruta graveolens, a spicy herb, when used in small amounts, may have some medical application. At the same time, if used in greater amounts, it could be a poison. So it's almost rarely used by anyone who's not an expert in these things. In fact, Ruta graveolens in the right dosage in a tea was used in the colonial times for women who needed to lose a child. And it was an abortive taken at certain times. So understanding these spices for cooking is one thing. Understanding them for religion and for medicine is also very important. Next slide, please. So setting the stage, who's who? Well, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time, as you might imagine, talking about the Queen of Sheba. I will talk right now just a little bit about Cleopatra and her use of spices. She not only used them in the food that she ate as Queen of Egypt, but she apparently, her favorite perfume was a perfume made out of the spice called cinnamon. And so she wore that when she seduced Julius Caesar. And she probably wore it when she seduced Mark Antony. And she was probably very disappointed when, led away in captivity, she was unavailable to have access to her favorite perfume. We also know that as a beauty treatment, she would have baths of water infused with saffron. That's an expensive bath additive. But that apparently she believed that it enhanced the softness of her skin, it enhanced the glow of her skin. Now, the Duke of Cornwall, anybody recognize that fellow there on the right-hand side? There's an interesting last story I'll tell you about how the British crown and spices are still interacting today. James, next slide, please. So the incense route, which was bringing spices predominantly out of the Arabian Peninsula, but also probably out of sections of Ethiopia, into the Middle East and into Europe. Next slide, James. Now, the incense route, as best understood by people who write history books, thrived from around 700 BC to AD 300. I'm going to say that as an archaeologist who studies archaeological material, we should add a 3 in front of that 700 BC. That as early as 3700 BC, we have clear evidence of the incense trade coming through Arabia and it coming up to the shores of the Mediterranean. The site that we have it at was excavated by American archaeologists in the country of Israel, a site called Gilat. And in the excavations of Gilat, they found a sanctuary to a female goddess. We know that she's female because there were multiple representations of her. And she was giving offerings on incense burners. And what was being offered to her, burnt on that, was charcoal with then frankincense that was added on top of it. This was a site of great ceremonial importance because there were constantly being offered animal sacrifices. And in fact, there are a few what appear to be human sacrifices that were being offered there at the site called Gilat. And it stands as a fantastic evidence of the spice trade, the incense trade, going back as far as 3,700 BC. If you ever on a cruise and you have a chance to go to Israel, those artifacts are all on display in the Israel National Museum, and they are really stunning to see and to realize that the incense route originated at least probably 3,700 BC, but its high point 700 BC to AD 300. The diminishing of the spice trade around the incense trade around AD 300 comes about because of the rise of, guess what? Christianity. Because the use of incense was extremely important in Roman temples and even in Roman households. Every household would have a small shrine to the Lares, the gods and goddesses that watched over the family. And if you wanted the gods and goddesses to happily help your family, you would make small burnt offerings to them, not just of charcoal, but of small spices and incense on that charcoal. By about AD 300, Christianity had what? Largely replaced the pagan traditions. And while Christianity uses some incense in its services, it didn't use anywhere the same amount that had been during the time of paganism. So that's why we have sort of a pretty clear terminus for the time of the incense round. Next slide, James. The world's first luxury. In Arabic, it's called Lubnan. And if you ever have a chance on a cruise, I'm plugging cruises, if you ever have a chance to be on a cruise that stops in Muscat, Oman, there is a phenomenal spice market where there are spices from all across Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And there are multiple varieties of these fragrant spices that come as tree sap that literally comes sort of like the way maple syrup comes off of a maple tree. When these trees have been cut, or sometimes not even cut, they will ooze these saps that are gathered, crushed, sorted, graded, and then used to create perfumes as well as to create modern day incense. Next slide. So, frankincense, the first global industry, and the Queen of Sheba, who we have described in the Hebrew text as having visited King Solomon. And what's really interesting is that as archaeologists, we haven't found Queen Sheba was in this house, but we have found distinctive pottery with a South Arabian script written on it that would very much support the idea that there had been a trade contact between the Hebrew communities along the coast of the Mediterranean and highland areas, and then the Semitic populations that Sheba belonged to far down in the area of her kingdom. And why did the Queen of Sheba possibly come to visit Solomon? The Jewish writers leave with the idea that she was impressed by the stories of his wisdom. And it's interesting that the traditions of the Queen of Sheba visiting occur not only in the Hebrew text, but also in the Quran, in the Arab tradition. And we have her name. She's not called the Queen of Sheba. She's called Bilquis. And I'm suspecting that she may well have come up to visit a gentleman named Solomon, the king, because there was a big reputation about him. But she was a very smart lady. She was hoping to do what? Make a trade agreement that Solomon's temple, which probably burnt hundreds of pounds of frankincense every day, that Solomon would only buy the Queen of Sheba variety of frankincense. Can you see that? Is that smart merchandising? And indeed, if there was a love affair that went along with it, well, I hope both of them enjoyed it. But the evidence of trade routes and bringing frankincense shows up in these famous texts in the traditions of the Jewish community and in the Muslim communities. And it shows up also in the evidence of archaeology. In the very area where we reconstruct her kingdom to be, there are magnificent ruins. And there are temples, probably at the site of Marib, that may well have been the ones where she herself burnt incense to her own gods and goddesses. Now, if you have a chance on a cruise to ever visit Jordan, without a doubt, go to Petra. The rose-colored city is just astonishing. Built not by Queen of Sheba, but by people who are part of the other groups of incense merchants, the Nabateans. And this incredible site, you can see there the treasury, which was the tomb of one of their great kings that you're first confronted with as you go down that passageway. When you see all this wonderful wealth at Petra, you have to realize it was all based on incense trade. And that the Romans would eventually conquer the Nabateans and take over the city of Petra because they wanted to what? Eliminate the middleman in the incense trade. And then as the Roman Empire changed its religious focus, well, Petra and the Nabateans found themselves no longer with very viable commodities to sell. James, next slide. Now, in the story of incense, a few of you may have heard of a place called Ubar because of a book written by Ralph Fiennes. The book is entitled Atlantis of the Sands. Ralph Fiennes is a famous British explorer who, before becoming an explorer, had served as a military advisor from the British military to the King of Oman. And he developed a close relationship. The King of Oman and him were one-on-one, best buddies. Well, when Fiennes was living in Oman, he had heard rumors about this famous place in the middle of the desert where the great caravans would water the camels and where huge profits were made in the spice trade. And so for 6 years on his free time, he and friends would take jeeps and go out into the desert area searching for it. After 6 years of fruitless searching, he got a memo from, of all things, NASA. Archaeologists working with NASA space scientists looking at the great sand desert in the area of Oman had picked up an anomaly in the sand. And they gave him those coordinates. And Ralph Fiennes did what I love to call ground truthing. He went out there and discovered that at that location, there were archaeological features. There was walls and towers and a large well. And indeed, the archaeologists, with his assistance, were able to begin the excavation and documentation of the site. He played an important role because if he hadn't had the permission of the King of Oman, guess what? You could look at it from outer space as long as you wanted to, but you would not be able to prove that it was one of these important places on the incense route, going back probably as early as 3000 BC. Next slide, James. So the Silk Road. Now, all of us have had to learn about the Silk Road in one way or another in high school or college. You have to realize that nobody called it the Silk Road in medieval times or in Roman times. The term actually gets coined just about 150 years ago by a geographer who wanted a handy term to hang on it. And so the Silk Road is something that we talk about today. It most definitely existed. Next slide, James. You can see the Silk Road, an overland route of it, from the 2nd century BC up to the 15th century AD, starting in China, flowing through various areas of Mongolia, flowing through Persia, and then eventually heading to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. One of my great pleasures was to excavate a site on the Silk Road with my wife for over a decade in northern Syria. Yeah, there's a good reason we're not working on that dig today. But along a branch of the Silk Road, Nethery Fuller and I excavated at a site called Tel Tunanir. And guess what? On the Silk Road, almost every other building we excavated was a hotel, because these caravans bringing the silk needed places where the animals could get food and water, where they could be sheltered. These hotels all had security systems, because robbery was a constant problem on the Silk Road. And it was very interesting. In our excavation, we found a hotel on the Silk Road, and when we excavated in the interior, we found a room that had gold coins and glass with gold and enamel decoration on it. Yeah, that was the five-star hotel. And then 2 blocks away, next to the meat market, we found a hotel where all the coins were copper and no fancy glass work was found at all. That was the budget hotel. And it all depended on what kind of silk trader you were and how much money you could afford to spend as you traveled from China to get silks to the Mediterranean. Because once you got that silk to the Mediterranean, to the Romans, silk was worth its weight in gold. And indeed, any Roman woman of prestige and status would have several silk garments that she could wear to show to her friends and family how successful and wealthy her husband was. Oh boy, that must have stabbed me in the heart if I had to buy a dress worth its weight in gold. But that was a way of determining status and prestige. By the way, not only with Romans, but also with, guess who? Vikings. Yes, when a Viking man went trading, or if he didn't have enough to trade, raiding, if he could put his hands on silk, he would bring that back, and it would be, again, a highly prized commodity to barter with, or to better gift it to his mother, his wife, and his daughters. Because then they had the great privilege of saying, see this fine silk brought back by my husband from Constantinople. Where's your good silk? So silk was certainly a way, like fine cars are today, and fine watches, of people establishing their status. Next slide, James. Several important cities along the Silk Road. Alexandria, Egypt, one of my favorite ones. Constantinople, which, yes, is called Istanbul today. Another. Istanbul and Alexandria were where the Silk Road terminated. It ended, and then European merchants purchased it and took that on with them. Next slide. Now, the spice route and the origins of spices. There are a number of spices that come uniquely out of China. Cassia, which is cinnamon, and ginger, very important spices. There are also spices down in the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, nutmeg and cloves, and a variety of important spices coming out of the Indian subcontinent, pepper and cardamom. Next slide. Now, you know what happened was to try to make it sound like an impossible thing. When the Greeks and Romans were asking spice merchants, where is this spice obtained? Well, they got fed baloney. They got fed misinformation. Herodotus says that cassia grows in an area infested by numbers of winged beasts, making hideous cries and assaulting boldly. Another story was that cinnamon was actually mined out of the moon and brought by Chinese sorcerers who could fly back to the earth. That was just a way of saying, you're not going to be able to make this. It's not going to be something you can cultivate or do in your own environment. They are unique plant products. I was surprised Herodotus got fooled, but he got fooled a couple of times with stories like this. Next slide. The fall of Constantinople, its change in name from Constantinople to Istanbul, occurred in 1453. Mehmet II, also called Mehmet the Conqueror, because he conquered the city, made a huge change in the way of which silks and spices came into Europe. Mehmet decided that he was going to shut down the flow of silks and spices into Europe because he just thought that would add extra pressure and insult, as his plan was, by the way, to conquer all of Europe and to spread all of the world under his control. The sudden loss of the spice trade and silks to wealthy Europeans meant, well, there needed to be some substitutions found. There didn't seem to be any way to grow these things in the local environments of Europe. So various navigators and ship owners were tasked with the idea of finding a way to bring to us these luxury things that are so important. Next slide. The golden age and the spice route. Better straighten this bow tie a little bit. Well, there we go. Next slide, please. So the maritime route, starting around 1498, is meant to get away from the problems that were being caused by the Ottoman Empire's shutdown of this route of spices coming in. And of course, it's going to be Vasco da Gama who becomes the great hero of finding a way to get all the way out of Europe, around the Horn of Africa, and into the spice areas of India. Next slide. For Christ and for spices, accordingly, is the claim that da Gama announced as his ships left. Okay, was he really interested in spreading Christianity? Well, it's a debatable question. I would wager you, though, that when he shouted and he had the name Christ before spices, he was making sure, guess what? The Almighty would help him get his boats back, that they would not die in the attempt, and that spices were there, but he was probably shouting that because his full crew of Catholic sailors were probably a little jittery about what their assignment was and what their odds were of returning back alive. And so calling out Christ and spices was his way of basically saying, please, Jesus, let us get there and let us get back with some spices. That would be nice too. Next slide, please. So Vasco da Gama, of course, had to make landfall several times in Africa to get fresh water, to get fresh meat, driven sometimes in by storms to find shelter in harbors, but eventually would make his way to Calicut and to, most importantly, Goa. And oh my gosh, cruise ships sometimes offer shore excursions for spice tasting in Goa. Delicious, safe, worth it every way to walk through a spice plantation and to see the continued cultivation of all these wonderful spices, the spices that Gama himself wanted so badly to bring back. Next slide. So in the 16th century, as soon as da Gama is able to chart and show the possibility of safely making it from Europe to India, well, the decision is that all these places he landed at need to become fortified, need to become locations that are going to be providing provisions for the ships going through these areas. And so you quickly have the colonization along coastal Africa and along coastal India of various European powers, beginning with the Portuguese, obviously. Next slide. Now, in the process of acquiring the spice trade, an interesting trade happened. One of the islands in the Spice Islands had actually been, quote, discovered by the British. And so they had laid claim to it. They had put up a settlement there. And the little island of Run, they discovered, was full of nutmeg trees. And this was going to mean they had a pretty much lock on the control of that amount of spice reaching into Europe. Now, the Portuguese and the Spanish and other groups were trying to figure out what they could trade for that small little island. And the Dutch one day said, you know, we've got a little foothold in the New World, a place called New Amsterdam. We would trade British the control of New Amsterdam for this little island full of nutmeg. In a funny way, it sounds like a bad trade when it happened in 1664. But of course, it turned out to be a great trade for the British because eventually people figured out how to grow nutmeg in different environments. And Run was not be one of the sole provisions of it. But New Amsterdam would become, guess what? Renamed and become New York and become one of the important British colonies in the area of the New World. Next slide, James. Oh, great spice cities in Europe. The Doge's Palace in Venice. Have you been there? Everyone raise your hand if you've seen it. All right. The Blame Tower in Lisbon, Portugal. Have you been there? Raise your hand if you've seen it. Yes, I have mine up. The East India House in Amsterdam, which is now still standing, but is used as part of the University of Amsterdam. Been there? Wonderful place. But none of you will ever get to visit the old East India House of London. Why? Because in 1860, it was torn down. Oh, shucks. Well, apparently it was not as quite elaborate a location as the Doge's Palace or the East India House in Amsterdam, and it had fallen into disrepair. If you want to visit in London today, James is making notes on this. It's a very famous landmark in downtown London. It is where the Lloyd's building stands. Yes, the Lloyd's of London is ironically built on the very foundation of what had been one of the great spice trading centers in the time of medieval Europe. Next slide, please. So I really love this illustration of a Dutch East India Company ship because it's not made by an artist from Europe. It's actually made by a Japanese artist who was showing all of the beautiful flags and the mast and the sail of this fleet of ships, not one ship, but hundreds of ships that belong to the British East India, the Dutch East India, and the Portuguese East India companies. And these were ships not only to carry the spices, but they were ships to protect. There were ships with cannons and with sailor marines who were there to make sure pirates did not take this valuable commodity that was being traded. Next slide, please. So the legacy of the Incense Road, the Silk Road, and the Spice Road. I've almost concluded the lecture. Well, a few more stories. I've got to get Prince Charles in there somehow, too. Let me think about that. Okay, next slide. So the spice trade created great prosperity for those countries that had naval resources and were able to establish for themselves beachheads, if you would, along the coast of Africa and India. There was great wealth to be made by bringing a spice ship in. There was protectionism, protecting these ports and protecting the ships and the shipping routes, which led to several conflicts between different European superpowers, which today sometimes don't like to remember that because they'd rather be a unity of European countries. But those conflicts did drive wedges between these different countries during the time of what we call colonialism. And spice trade, just like silk trade, is still very, very important. Sadly, incense trade doesn't carry a huge economic value to it compared at all with silk or with spices. Next slide. Oh, international flavors and foods on the right-hand side is not my wife's favorite spice. No, my wife is a McCormick gal. And I can tell you, she's listening in behind the chair. If she hits me, I'll know I have it wrong. But her favorite spice in all the world is a mixture called Old Bay. And it goes amazing on crab and on seafood. And it's a spice mixture. It's got cumin and pepper and a variety of things all added to get just the perfect taste in the mouth. And oh, the most perfect fragrance to the nose as it's steaming. Next slide. Here, there he is. I'm next to Prince Charles. Wow, that's cool. Prince Charles is a property owner in many areas that the Crown has given him a receipt for. He is received the Duchy of Cornwall back in the 1950s. The Duchy of Cornwall has been granted to various members of the Crown ever since 1337. And when he received this title, he went to Cornwall, and the citizens of Cornwall, under feudal obligations, were required to give him a variety of gifts. He got a salmon spear. He got a fine pair of white kid gloves. And he got 100 silver shillings and that's about $6. And he also got a pound of mixed cumin and black pepper. Now, in 1337, a pound of mixed cumin and black pepper would be a fortune. Today, it's $14 on Amazon. And, you know, it's how things have changed because the trade of these spices has become easier. The embargoes and colonialism that kept a stranglehold on these things have diminished. I hope he took his pound of cumin and pepper back to the palace and allowed the cook to marinate a good roast in it, because I can just imagine how delicious it would have been. But there is a man who received, not every year, but once in his life, he received a pound of spices. And each small village in Cornwall was responsible for giving him a different things. We even got 2 fine hunting dogs. I bet he kept those. So I think, James, that is our last slide. Oh, spices before, salt, the luxury frankincense, spices for medicine, for cooking, for cosmetics, the Silk Road, the Maritime Spice Road, and now the world's international companies. Next slide, please. Ah, there. I love looking at that tray of spices. It just reminds me so much of traveling in the Middle East and all the spice markets, my favorite places to go and visit and shop, because I love to cook and I love to brew. I love to eat and drink. I bet that's true of you also. All right. Well, James, I think it's time for Heather to bounce a couple of questions off me.
Thank you, Michael. We'll start with a question from Christopher Solano in the US. He says, some shops only sell spices in jars, and these amounts are not usually used up within a year. How long can one keep spices before they need to be tossed out?
It varies from one spice to another. Some will lose their potency very rapidly, and that's why they need to be kept out of the air. They need to have a limited amount of oxygen. And if you're not using it all up in a year, then my advice is to be more generous with your spices, or to cook for a larger party of friends, and you'll go through them. It was very interesting. A few years ago, I was in Jordan, and at the home of a family that were teaching traditional Jordanian cooking, and they had a group of American and British tourists there, and they said, we're going to now add spices to the soup. And they put a small teaspoon of spice in. They go, do you think that was enough? And everyone nodded their head. And the family, the matriarch, shook her head. She goes, no. And she filled her hand with the spice and dropped it in the soup. And she goes, now you will taste something, not just a hint of it. You'll have the full value of it. So there are some spices that last quite long in the jars, and some that they'll just go stale. They won't go rancid. They won't smell bad, but you'll have to use a lot more of them to get the same flavor component in whatever you're cooking. Excellent question, by the way.
Thank you. That's really good advice. Susan in the United States asks, is there any difference between the spices used in northern and southern India?
Oh, yes. I had an archaeologist from India stay with me several years ago, and he was a very interesting man, because I said, we have many Indian restaurants in St. Louis. And the first night we took him to one, and he ate the food, but you sort of saw a disappointment in his face. And the next day, as we were preparing to take him to a different restaurant, he said, you know, I am from southern India, where the food must be extra strongly spiced. And you took me to the food that would be from Madras, or from the north, where it's very mildly spiced. So I quickly found for him the only Southern India restaurant in St. Louis, and the food was on fire. And in fact, as my friend was eating, he was crying. Tears were coming down his face. It was so hot. He's from India. I said, oh my gosh, is this bad? He goes, no, it's like my mother cooks it. It makes you cry. It's so good. So the cooking, not everyone in Southern India spices super high, but it was interesting to hear from an archaeologist in India that he could, with his eyes closed, tell you whether it was spiced by a chef from the south of India or the north of India. Same spices, but different, well, some different spices, but many of the same spices, just the amount of their use in the sauce and in the cooking.
Thank you, that's fascinating. Arnold in Barnesville asks, the salmon and garlic mustard found in the cooking pot is fascinating. This sounds like a very sophisticated dish. Would this have been something only very wealthy people ate at this time, or would this have been part of the diet of ordinary people?
Excellent question, by the way. And one of those things that would be hard to pretty much understand unless you had a large skeletal population to sort of look for the trace elements in the bones of. My guess is because the garlic mustard grows wild and could be pretty easily collected by anyone, that as a spice, it was readily available. And the question is how good a fisherman your husband is and how good a hunter your son is would determine how often that was a dish that you would enjoy or not. And would that same dish taste equally good with rabbit? Yeah, if you can't kill a deer, you can more likely catch a rabbit or snare a rabbit. And my family loved rabbits. They would never let me cook one with that. But I bet it would be pretty tasty with that dish also.
Thank you. Henriette asks, you mentioned the amazing spice market in Muscat, Oman. Can you recommend the best places to source high quality spices in the US?
Gosh. Here in St. Louis, Missouri, we've got 3 or 4 Middle Eastern markets, and we have 1 Asian market. And when I need spices in quantities and when I need quality spices, I don't go to the grocery store down the street from me. I go to one of these markets where, luckily, I speak Arabic and I can chat away with the owner and get what I believe are the best spices for my money. In New York City and in Los Angeles, that's going to be easily done. In smaller cities and more rural areas, you're going to be at your wits probably on the internet. And some of the internet spices I have had sent to me were wonderful. And sometimes they were a little less than perfect. But that's part of the job, part of the thrill of shopping for spices.
Absolutely, thank you. Loretta in San Antonio asks, what was the most valuable spice in the ancient world?
I really want to say black pepper. And I say that only because as an archaeologist, I've been doing work at a site called Caesarea Maritima, a medieval city on the coastline. And according to the Crusader records, when they captured the city of Caesarea, there was huge rejoicing because there was an immense amount of black pepper found in the warehouses of the city officials. And each Crusader knight was given a cup full, imagine, a cup full of black pepper, which was a small fortune if he could then figure a way of getting that back into Europe. There were probably other spices. Saffron today is one of the most expensive, and probably saffron would have been the most expensive in medieval times. But pepper was so in high demand, and it still is in our diet, salt and pepper going together. Oh, I guess I'm going to say saffron was the most valuable. But in terms of the popular market, it would have been black pepper.
That's great, thank you. Gail in the United States says, hi, Michael, we're enjoying the presentation and the tie. Very nice there. She says, are there any spices native to North America?
Spices native to North America. Well, it's very interesting. My youngest brother, who's not that super young anymore, is an expert in the plants of the Osage Indian tribe. So much so that he has learned to speak some fairly decent Osage, and just last week was adopted by a member of the Osage tribe as a son of the tribe. And he's been working with a variety of different plants that were being used for a variety of purposes by the Osage tribe, some of them for flavoring food, some of them for keeping down pests inside the beds that they had as they slept inside of their traditional houses. And most of those spices and plant flavors today are known to the older members of the tribe, and but are rarely used. And it's been sort of fun to tease him that he needs to bring this and that form of red cedar berries for us to do some experimenting with, because that, for example, would be one of the things used. Hi, Gail. Say hello to Russell for me.
Thank you. Tricia in St. Paul asks, which trade route came first, and is there any evidence of this?
The incense route came first, and then followed by the silk route, and then finally by the maritime route for the spices. And partly because we can cite the historical texts describing these things, but even the archaeological evidence for these types of the wealth that grows up along these trade routes probably is the best evidence. The incense route first, then silk, then spice.
Thank you. Abigail in South Fork asks, are there any countries that relied on the export of specific spices, and are they still reliant on these today?
You know, the economy of the area around Goa in India is still heavily influenced by the production of spices. And indeed, with the problems of sometimes moving shipments of materials around the world with the pandemic, it's going to be interesting to see whether that's going to hurt the economy where the spices are being produced, and whether it will eventually cause shortages of spices at the end where those of us who live and use them are waiting for them.
Thank you. Susan Waldron in the United Kingdom says she loves spiced teas. Is that Bigelow's constant comment you're drinking, or a different flavour?
Oh, I'm not supposed to plug merchandise, am I? But you guessed it right. It's Bigelow's, yes.
Thank you. Anya Price in Venice says, were there any invasions or battles that were completely evolved around acquiring spices?
Oh, definitely. In the coast of India, particularly around the area of Goa, there was continued conflicts to control those port areas and to make sure that the harbors would be safe to one nation's and not the other nation. And in fact, the British maintained bases in many of these areas for a very long time, even after the spice trade itself was no longer an important and powerful component.
Thank you. Denise asks, having had spices confiscated at US Customs, do you know what the rules are for bringing spices in from foreign markets?
You're always best to bring spices in that are in a sealed container, because if you bring them in a loose, like Ziploc baggie, then they could be easily as some form of drugs or some non-allowed material. And so if you bring them in a loose container and a way in which it looks like you've added it yourself or collected it yourself, which is too bad because I like collecting my own spices, you run a risk of having them taken away by U.S. Customs. They're very much concerned, by the way, that you not bring a spice in that might contain some kind of insect pest that, if it got loose into the environment of the United States, could cause havoc. And so I understand why they need to be fairly strict about these things. Oh my gosh, I was once in an airport flying back from the Middle East, and they opened up the suitcase of a young woman, and it was full of corn on the cob. And the custom guys began taking it all out and saying, you are not allowed to have this. And she didn't understand in English. And I stepped over and I tried to quietly explain that it was forbidden to bring fresh products in, or even products that looked a little questionable if they were dried. And she asked me, she goes, how big of a problem? And I said, sijin, which is the Arabic word for prison. She goes, take it. It was corn from the family farm that she was bringing to cook for her grandfather in Chicago. And I agreed with her she could probably get some corn that would not taste quite the same, but would keep her out of problems. So no, almost all countries now have serious restrictions about fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. And if you're bringing something in your suitcase that's not sealed and prepared, then it's very likely to get confiscated. I've had it happen.
Thank you. Linda in Roanoke asks, are vanilla beans grown anywhere else besides Madagascar?
Yeah, I think they're growing in Tahiti. When I was on the Around the World cruise with Viking, and we stopped, I got vanilla in Madagascar, and I'm almost positive I got vanilla in Tahiti, and I did not cook with it. No, 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 no. I made a delicious stout with the vanilla bean flavor in it. And a few of you might know in England what a stout is, even some Americans. It's a hearty beer. It's a hearty drink. And those vanilla beans from Madagascar and Tahiti, I couldn't tell a difference in them myself. But you know what my wife would say, I've got a guy's taste buds. There probably are some subtle differences between them.
Thank you. Shelton in Silver Spring says, what's the best cooking method to capture the essence of a spice?
Well, the longer you boil something in a spice, the more the aromatics are going to be released, which means it's going to fill your kitchen with the wonderful odor. But the longer you boil something with a spice, at a certain point, you begin to lose some of the potency within the food itself. And that's true for brewing as well as for cooking. So in several recipes, you'll find a note that the spice should be added close to the end of the cooking process. Because if you add it at the very beginning, while it will cook in with the food, you may eventually end up degrading it or losing so much of the odor and the aroma, which will fill your kitchen, will be absent from the food. So oftentimes adding the spice towards the end, this is even true of brewing. It's oftentimes added at the end during a second fermentation so that it's not lost during the time of the more robust first fermentation.
Thank you. And I think we just have time for one more question. This one is from Barry in Sarasota. He asks, are spices taxed differently from other foods?
Heather said that there would be a question I could not answer, and she has saved it till the end. I have no idea whether coming into the United States there would be a differential tax rate for spices versus other food products. That's an excellent question, and I'll have to do some research on that. And I'll see if James can do the same in England to see if there's any difference there.
Thank you, Michael. Barry will get back to you on that one. That's all we've got time for on the questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, James. Thank you for everyone who watched. Stay safe.